Okay, so may I now invite Stella to present to us on their case study from Cote d'Ivoire.
Great. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-author, Abdoulaye Traore, and also to thank Global Affairs Canada for funding this study and Drivers of Food Choice for supporting my participation in this conference. I also want to note that I'm currently with GAIN, but the research that I'm presenting today relates to my time with Helen Keller International. So I really lucked out today because Pepin did a great job already of motivating why we should care about the sustainability of nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions. So I'll just add that this study is aiming to also help fill that research gap, but by looking at a very different type of intervention, which is a group-based approach to nutrition-sensitive agriculture. So the project in question was implemented by Helen Keller International over a period of 3 years in rural northern Cote d'Ivoire. The idea of this project was to use existing women's groups as a platform for nutrition-sensitive agriculture, to increase the production and consumption of nutrient-rich vegetables, chickens, and eggs, with an end goal of improving the nutrition of women and young children. There were 3 main components. For gardening, each woman's group was provided with infrastructure and support to create a communal garden or village model farm at the level of their village. They were also given planting materials for nutrient-rich crops and training on improved agricultural techniques for growing them. For poultry rearing, each group received an improved hen house, as well as a flock of hybrid or improved breed chickens, and training on how to raise them in an intensive production approach. Finally, all the women were targeted with behavior change communication on nutrition WASH topics, and also invited to participate in women's empowerment activities. And the idea of the project was that by providing this infrastructure and training, these groups would continue to exist in the long term and continue to function to produce nutrient-rich foods which could be used for home consumption with any surplus being sold. So the objective of our study was really to go back a year and a half later and figure out if that was happening. Our research questions, we had 3 main research questions. Did the groups continue to use the gardens and the hen houses? Did those facilities remain productive with the work and the benefits being shared equally among the members of the groups? And did they remain nutrition sensitive? In which case we're looking at the diversity of what's produced, the type of crops that are produced, and then what happens to that production. For methods, we went back 18 months after the project ended to 12 of the initially targeted villages. We did a quantitative survey of a random sample of former participants. We did 50 in-depth interviews with leaders and members of these groups. We undertook structured observations at all the hen houses and the gardens, and we did reviews of any production records that the groups were keeping. And with all of this data, we compared it to monitoring data that was collected using similar methodologies several times during the project. So something important to note here is that we do not have a control group, nor do we have true baseline data. So in this study, we're not able to say anything about the long-term impact of this project. We're just able to compare what happened after to what happened during the project. So I'll jump into the results, and just to say, there are a lot more numbers and tables and significant tests and even some regressions behind this, but given the short time today, I've really just stuck to the bullet points. If you want more details, please come talk to me later. So in terms of positive outcomes, one thing we found that there was strong continued membership in these women's groups. All the groups still existed, and over 90% of the women continued to be members of the groups. At the same time, we found that there was lower use of the gardens and lower productivity. So only about a quarter of the gardens were fully planted at the time that we visited and undertook observations. Sales of products continued, and they continued to make a fair amount of money within the local context, but the levels were lower than they had been during the project. In addition, we found that there was a general shift from collective management, where everybody is working together, growing things together, and jointly managing the sale and control of those assets, to a much more individual-focused approach, where each person had their own parcel within the communal garden, and they made their own management and sale decisions about that plot. Considering the potential nutrition impact of the garden, we found that there was a general fall in crop diversity, and there were declines in production of the main promoted nutrient-rich crops, so things like orange flesh sweet potato, squash, carrot, and moringa. It's important to note that these were all still being produced, particularly orange flesh sweet potato, which had been introduced in this area by the project and had not been available before. So there was some lasting positive impact, but the levels were considerably lower than during the project. In its place, we found that there was an increase in production of really market-oriented crops, such as hot pepper, and that there was also a decline in the portion of the harvest that was used for consumption as opposed to being sold. So to sum up the results for the gardens, groups were all still there, they were all still functioning, the gardens were all still being used, but they were being used less than they had been during the project, and there had been a general shift towards more of a market orientation and more of an individualistic approach as opposed to a group-based approach with a real focus on nutrient-rich crops. Turning to the poultry, we found again that all of the hen houses still existed and they were all still in really good shape. At the same time, only 3 out of the 12 were still being used to keep chickens at the time that we visited. And out of those 3, 2 of them had very small flocks, about half the chickens that they had at the end of the project. We also found that there was a shift towards non-intensive, lower productivity techniques as opposed to what had been promoted during the project, and a fall in egg production. In addition, we found that only about a quarter of the participants were still participating in raising chickens through these communal hen houses. Usually instead, it was just 1 or 2 people responsible for a hen house within a given village. And there was one exception to this. I said that this was the case in 2 out of 3 villages. The third village, which was still raising chickens, was highly productive. They were raising cycles of several hundred broilers, which they did several times a year. They were earning almost $2,000 per cycle, and they'd expanded twice. They'd built a new facility, and they'd added ducks in addition to just chickens. So we were very excited at first to find this result. This was great, but then we realized that the facility had been taken over by a local man who was now managing it, with very little of the benefits actually going to the women's group that had been targeted by the project. In addition, because he was raising broilers for sale to urban markets, there was probably a fairly limited nutrition impact within the village itself. So overall, these were not the results that we really had hoped to find. We found that there was fairly disappointing sustainability for this intensive group-based poultry rearing approach. So why? What are some of the reasons for what we saw? Well, we looked out and then we had a real wealth of qualitative data that we could exploit to look at that. And from this, we found 2 main emerging areas. First, having to do with motivations. One thing that didn't emerge from the interviews that we did with women who were current and former members of these groups was nutrition. Nutrition was not really something they spoke about when they talked about why they wanted to be members of these women's groups. Instead, they talked about solidarity and mutual support that they got from being a part of these women's groups. They also talked about the ability to earn some additional income beyond just their family production, and that having this income gave them more autonomy within their households. Now, both of those goals were things that could be met just as easily by putting more of a focus on growing for the market and doing it in a more individualistic way, as opposed to the nutrient-sensitive approaches that had originally been promoted by the project. In addition, people brought up several different challenges. One of those was that in the absence of project incentives and project monitoring, they had some problems with free riders. So people in the group who didn't do quite as much work, but still expected to share equally in the benefits. And this is what had led them to generally go away from a collective gardening approach to divide the gardens up into individual parcels that each person can manage individually and benefit from individually. And this proved to be a particularly large challenge when it came to chicken rearing. With a garden, if the garden didn't get watered for 1 or 2 days, the plants would probably survive. You could go back on the 3rd day, you could water it, and it would probably come back. If the chickens didn't get fed or watered for a few days, or if one of them got sick and nobody noticed and nobody did anything about it, those could lead to decimation of an entire flock. And these groups did not have enough capital to be able to recover from a shock that big. So that is one of the main things behind the downfall of chicken rearing in several of the villages. In addition, women expressed that they felt a real lack of confidence with this new technique of intensive poultry raising. Within this area of Cote d'Ivoire, chickens are something that is traditionally associated with men. So men are the ones who raise chickens, not women, and women in particular did not have access to the same input and output markets for intensive improved breed poultry production. So once they were left on their own and no longer had the project support, women just didn't really feel that confident to keep going with this activity. And that kind of opened a door for somebody who was already in a position of more power, such as local man who had some experience with this type of production before, to kind of come in and take over the activities and capture the benefits of the project for himself instead of the group. So in conclusion, this was a very specific case study of a very particular project, and it suffered from certain methodological limitations. As I mentioned, we did not have a control group. It's also a fairly short follow-up period, just a year and a half after the project ended. At the same time, there are a few kind of broader conclusions that we could consider drawing from this work. The first is that while there are certain appeals to group-based approaches in that they seem to have more efficiency, they can perhaps benefit from economies of scale, build local social capital, use the power of collective action to gain access to resources, they also come with their own downsides because each group brings with it its own group dynamic, and those kind of considerations also need to be taken into account in designing a project and in envisioning how that will work in the long term. In addition, there's also this study, aligned to a lot of studies from the agricultural technology adoption literature, that show that in the long term, people tend to pursue activities that align to their own economic self-interest. In this case, that resulted in a shift away from more nutrient-rich crop production to those that were more lucrative for the market. So when we're considering that in the design of interventions, we can either consider if there are potential ways to better align what's lucrative and what's nutrient-rich, or perhaps to focus more on the income pathway towards improved nutrition by trying to increase people's incomes through market-oriented production and encourage them to use that income to improve nutritional outcomes of their households.